Wrestling with Shadows is a 1998 documentary that follows a year in the life of one of the biggest wrestling superstars of all time, and current WWF champion at that time also, Bret the Hitman Hart. As many of you will know, what makes the film so interesting is that not only does it offer a really rare fly-on-the-wall backstage type of look into the workings of professional wrestling, but it also happens to be set against the backdrop of Bret Hart's famous falling out with the WWF that culminated in the Montreal Screw Job, and a subsequent jump to rival promotion WCW. So the film starts, and right off the bat a very serious tone is established. We see Bret in a variety of shots of him backstage preparing for the Montreal Survivor Series. All the while a very moody, ominous soundtrack plays, interspersed with tribal wailing. It's all very brooding and dark, and I feel like the production team and Bret wanted to emphasize that this is all real and not fake. This is something that we're reminded of several times throughout the film. I suppose it's fair enough. People do tend to view pro wrestling as fake. Despite the many documented cases of injuries and even deaths caused by working in the ring, imagine how you'd feel if someone you met at a party said that your job in HR that you worked at for years was phony. There have certainly been many cases of wrestlers getting a little bit too upset at people calling their business fake over the years, and I feel that this film is sometimes trying to act as some sort of public service announcement. Bret's first lines of the film are, "It's so hard to find a hero. Anywhere." He goes on to describe the Hitman character that he's worked so hard to build for the last 15 years. How the Hitman fights for the right causes and speaks for the truth. Bret tells us he loves being a hero, and we cut to a very 90s shot of Bret wearing a white t-shirt, tucked into white shorts, visiting a crowd of cheering kids in a school in India. We then cut to a dark hotel hallway and a solitary Hitman wheeling his luggage behind him. Bret's narration explains that tomorrow is the big showdown in Montreal, and that as he is going to be leaving the WWF, he has to lose and drop the championship to Shawn Michaels. Bret says he can't do that, and we get his famous line of, "I'd just as soon blow my brains out," from a character perspective at least. This is probably the first hint that Bret is a very serious guy, who takes his character very seriously. Some might say a little too serious. We're soon introduced to the movie's antagonist, Vince McMahon. Our first look at Vince in this film is of him during his famous "Bret Screwed Bret" monologue, recorded just after Bret left the company. As the camera zooms in on Vince's face, you can see what looks to be a black eye under the makeup. I wonder how that got there. There's more on that later. From a wrestling fan's point of view, this is all fascinating stuff because what we're seeing here is the prototype evil Mr. McMahon character. By the time this movie was released in 1998, the Mr. McMahon character was in full swing on WWF programming. He doesn't have the over-the-top voice or mannerisms yet in this interview, but you can see that Vince has a new persona and that he realizes he's going to play a big part in the WWF's on-screen development in the future. Vince says that he has no sympathy for Bret, and now the story is set. We go back in time to a year earlier, which is actually more like 6 months earlier, in the summer of 1997 to be exact. The WWF are in Bret's hometown of Calgary for a big pay-per-view event. We see Bret in another tucked-in t-shirt and shorts combo, as he's introduced to all his adoring fans. Bret narrates and explains that he's been a wrestler for over 20 years, and that for most of those years he's worked for the WWF. Apparently 500 million people around the world watch the WWF each week. I'm not so sure about that number. That may have been the case in 1999, but in 1997 the WWF was famously not doing so well. We see our first of several really interesting backstage goings on though. We see Bret recording, and flubbing, his promos, interactions with various other wrestlers, and even Bret sort of flirting with the makeup woman, where she says that he must have had his 4 kids when he was 12 because he doesn't look 40. We also get our first of many shots of Bret either taking his shirt off or just being shirtless altogether in this film. We also see Bret going over promos with his fellow Hart Foundation members, while a baby-faced Vince Russo mills about between them. You can even see Jim Cornette in the background too, a time when Cornette and Russo were legally allowed 100 feet of each other. Happier days indeed. Bret introduces Sunny, who is often considered to be the first WWF diva. Sunny featured heavily on WWF programming in the mid-90s. Her raunchy character was all part of a new, more sexualized direction the WWF were taking at the time. There's an awkward scene where Bret introduces her. He goes on to say how she's always very flirtatious on and off screen, but to him she's just a good friend. And that's all. Just a friend. Even if the rumors about him and Sunny aren't true, Bret's summation of his relationship here with Sunny doesn't exactly scream not guilty. We're also introduced to the film's mid-level boss here, Shawn Michaels. Bret acknowledges Shawn's athleticism, but he also wastes no time in telling the audience what he actually thinks of him. Prima donna, arrogant, and obnoxious are all used in the same sentence. Shawn's cockiness and arrogance are all part of where the product is going in 1997. An edgier, more controversial direction. But Bret? Well, he's still Bret the Hitman Hart. Bret assures parents everywhere that your kids are safe watching him on Saturdays. He sends out a wholesome message. For me, this is where Bret's age starts to show. If you were old enough to remember the late 90s, you'd know that it was all about counterculture. Not just in wrestling, TV, movies, and music were all about trying to add shock value as much as possible. As much as I liked watching Bret Hart as a kid, I knew that by this time, his character and views on the business were of a bygone era. It's time to go back further in time, and we start learning about Bret Hart's childhood and upbringing. We see Bret's father, Stu Hart, celebrating his 82nd birthday at the family's home in Calgary. There's an interesting account from Bret's mother Helen about how she and the whole family seemingly got dragged into the wrestling business deeper and deeper as time went on. It genuinely sounds as if she's never been a massive fan of the business, as she didn't want her daughters getting married to wrestlers, but of course all 4 of her daughters did just that. The stories by and about Stu are both fascinating and a little terrifying. Stu Hart had a tough upbringing, and he was apparently just as tough on his kids. We hear stories of how Stu learned to wrestle in real submission wrestling fights. He was bullied by the other wrestlers, and he was anxious to be a bully himself. Bret recalls the screams of pain coming from the basement, or dungeon, as his father took pleasure in dishing out some very hard lessons to his students. One of the most iconic scenes of this film is of an 82-year-old Stu Hart demonstrating some submission moves on an eager young victim. Stu has this 20-something young guy tied in an absolute knot on the floor, screaming in agony and turning bright purple, and seems to have a hint of joy in his voice as he describes why this particular hold is causing so much pain. Bret recalls his dad squeezing him so hard in training that the blood vessels in his eyes would burst and that he'd go to school the next day with completely bloodshot eyes. Bret also says that there were times in his training where he thought he had breathed his last breath and that his dad was on the verge of going too far. I can understand that amateur wrestling is a tough sport and you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs, but some of these accounts sound quite terrifying for a child. It's hard to see how Bret's father's methods wouldn't be considered child abuse in this day and age. I don't know, it's different times, I guess. We learned that Bret never actually wanted to be a wrestler, but due to wrestlers not showing up for his dad's promotion, he got roped into it. By that time though, his dad's promotion was really struggling. It wasn't long until Stu sold his Calgary-based wrestling promotion to a cheeky young upstart called Vince McMahon, and Bret's wrestling career took off from there. There are some great shots from Calgary's Stampede wrestling archives here. We see not only a very young, fresh-faced Bret, but also his dad Stu, tag teaming with his son. Amazingly, Stu Hart still competed in the ring when he had to be at least 60. The trip down memory lane ends and we go back to 1997. At 40 years old, Bret is looking to wind his career down. He says he always considered he'd end his career in the WWF, but right at the last minute, WWF's main competition, WCW, owned by billionaire Ted Turner, swooped in with an incredible offer for Bret to jump ship. We don't know how much money is on the table just yet, but it's an enormous amount of money, Bret exclaims. This brings us to our second of many scenes of shirtless Bret. This time he's emerging from a sleepless night down to his kitchen where he says he tossed and turned all night thinking of the decision he had to make. More shirtless Bret. Bret explains the details of Ted Turner's offer while he goes for a swim, because it's as good a place as any to do so, right? WCW are offering him $9 million over 3 years. He goes on to explain that Vince can't match that amount of money, but he can offer him a 20-year contract. Bret says he feels like the prettiest girl at the ball with everybody trying to get his attention. Should Bret stay or go? Bret feels that Vince made him and gave him the stage to create his character, but at the same time, $9 million is a lot of money. In the end, Bret tells the world and his fans on WWF TV that he'll stay with the WWF forever. Cut to Bret's house where he's doing a spot of cooking. Shirtless. Seriously, does this guy not own enough shirts or something? Has he only got like one black one and one white one and they're always in the wash all the time? Anyway, for some reason Bret feels it's a good idea to cook a turkey without a shirt on, but by the time it's time to eat, he finally does find a shirt and everybody digs in. So Bret's staying with the Fed. It's here that we see some genuinely interesting backstage scenes of Bret and how matches and storylines are worked out. It's not easy to find footage like this where wrestlers, bookers, managers, and writers are planning out the detail of what's going to happen. At the time this movie was shot, the wrestling business was very much still protecting kayfabe, which is the fictional aspect of the wrestling business, so scenes like this are absolute gold. We see the aforementioned story play out in the ring, but we are quickly reminded again that wrestling is indeed real and that people often push themselves too far and get hurt. We get an account of how Bret suffered multiple broken ribs in one match. He should have taken 7 weeks off to fully recover, but the reality of the business is that if you're not working, you're not earning, so he went back out on the road sooner than he should have. It's kind of an interesting point, as 20 years later the WWE is still famous for not providing proper health coverage for individual wrestlers. So Bret decided to stay in the WWF out of loyalty, but he also goes on to flesh out the second reason as to why he didn't jump ship: his character. Bret felt at the time that he could always continue to be the good guy on WWF. WCW, though, were an unknown quantity, and he just couldn't be sure how they treat the Hitman character. We get some more interesting insights into the business here. Various bad guy characters like Mankind and Triple H are shown, and they explain what makes a good bad guy in wrestling. Bret says that something's changed recently, though. People are no longer interested in good guys. It's at this point in time that Stone Cold Steve Austin is beginning his rise to fame. Austin's character is where the fans are going now. Austin is supposed to be a bad guy, but people everywhere cheer him. Bret says that Vince wants to change the Hitman's character. He wants to make him a bad guy. Bret's lukewarm to the idea at first, but he eventually agrees, stating that there's only so many times the good guy can save the girl before people get bored. Bret walks down the stairs in his house complaining about the sissy shirt he has to wear here. Presumably he wanted another roaming around the house shirtless scene, but the director was having none of it. Cut to Bret's classic match versus Steve Austin at WrestleMania 13. Here we see where the Hitman begins to turn to the dark side. Bret explains that he can no longer understand the fans' side of things when they boo him and cheer for the bad guy who's smashing his knees to pieces with a chair. He doesn't want to be a bad guy and antagonize the fans just to sell Vince McMahon more tickets. I don't know about this. Wrestlers are actors, and isn't that what acting is? You portray a character. You don't need to actually be the character. I think Bret is so invested in wrestling and his character because wrestling is all he's ever really known. Had he become an actor and not a wrestler, his outlook on character portrayal may have been different. But Bret is a professional wrestler, and top professional wrestlers like him basically only play one character for a very long time. I can kind of see why he has trouble separating himself from the Hitman character. In any case, Bret says he's worried about alienating his true fans. We see the beginning of Bret's Canada versus the USA angle, as he delivers a speech on WWF television where he hilariously portrays Canada as the greatest country in the world and how it's filled with the nicest, kindest, most helpful people. We go back and forth to TV footage of Bret being the hero in Canada and being a despicable villain in the USA. Hilarious scenes of drunk 90s wrestling fans waiting outside to enter SummerSlam 1997 follow. One particularly incoherent man explains that Canada is full of crybabies and that Americans are the best people in the world and have all the rights to do anything they want because they fought. It's not all bad news for the Hitman though. One kind lady says that she believes in Bret and that Bret inspired her to go to school and study computer graphics. Maybe it was this one woman's support that spurred Bret on to win the WWF Championship that night at SummerSlam, or maybe it was just the fact that the ever-threatening Shawn Michaels smashed Bret's opponent over the head with a chair. Nevertheless, it's becoming apparent that the WWF are placing more and more stock into the ever-cocksure Shawn Michaels. Bret is the number one bad guy on the show at the time, but it seems that he may not even have that spot for much longer. Sad country and western music plays as Bret skulks backstage with the title belt. All is not well with Bret, but he still has time for shirtless opportunity number 3 in this film. Bret finds time to get in a quick shirtless workout at the gym. Bret's trainer says he's got another 10 years of wrestling left in him. Bret sees it more like a lifer in prison hanging around the prison yard. It must be really tough being headhunted by several companies with multi-million-dollar deals, right? Bret laments that his almost 15 years with the WWF has meant that he could never be at home enough. He starts wondering if he can call Ted Turner at WCW again and see if that sweet $9 million deal is still on the table. If so, Bret could hang up his boots in 3 years and spend more time at home. Presumably this is to learn how to play wrestling games on the PlayStation and mope next to his jacuzzi shirtless. By now it's apparent that the writing's on the wall. Bret is growing tired of the business and the WWF are in the process of slowly replacing him with Shawn Michaels. We see a promo from TV of Shawn Michaels and his gang of young rebels, D-Generation X. They make fun of the Hitman's age and charisma. A younger, softer voiced Triple H joins in on the fun and starts talking about his dick. Bret is visibly angry. This is not the WWF he knows anymore. The WWF is no place for old men, it would seem. It's around this time that Vince McMahon drops an apparent bombshell and tells Bret that he wants out of their 20-year contract. Bret's cat looks worried. Bret tells his wife that the WWF is in financial peril. Vince has told him that he'd be doing everyone a favor if he asked Ted Turner for his old deal again. Bret is in turmoil once again. He asks the director for one more shirtless scene of him in the house, but doesn't get it, so they settle on Bret leaving about 3 too many buttons of his shirt undone. good news though. WCW called Bret and are practically begging him to come and work for them. But Bret still looks troubled, lying in the middle of a wrestling ring. Bret tells Vince that he can no longer be a great good guy, and he can no longer be a great bad guy. He has no more reason to stay in the WWF. So in a very 90s act, he tells Vince by fax that he's leaving the WWF for WCW after the Survivor Series in Montreal. So now it's official, Bret is leaving the WWF. And now that he's leaving, he becomes very vocal about his opinions on the direction that the WWF is taking. Bret may have a point about some of the WWF's ideas, like the race-based gang warfare storylines, for example, but I think it's pretty obvious that Bret's ship has sailed when it comes to values and ideas on the wrestling business. Although they're not there yet, the WWF is at the start of a popularity upswing. They're still behind WCW in the ratings, but the gap is closing. Bret Hart in the WWF in late 1997 is very much the nail that sticks out. He's either going to be hammered down or just get yanked out completely. We get to Survivor Series, and by now Vince has told Bret that he wants him to drop the belt to Shawn, as he can't have Bret potentially show up on WCW television with a WWF title. Bret says he'll lose the belt, but not in Canada. Bret feels they can come to some arrangement, as he has creative control for the last 30 days of his contract. His wife is worried Vince and his crew might try something funny on the night though. Ominously, Bret says that he doesn't have to worry about the match referee, Earl Hebner. Earl has apparently sworn on his kids that he's not going to let anything happen. He can trust Earl. It's the day of the big fight in Montreal, and we see Bret sign an autograph and shake hands with a little girl who seems utterly confused as to what's going on. Surely the crew didn't stage anything in this documentary, right? We return to the scene of Bret in his hotel room, and this time Bret likens what he thinks the WWF want to do to him in his final match is rape him in the ring. I thought the blowing my brains out line was a little over the top, but comparing it to rape is just too far in my opinion. Again, it's just a character, it's not real, it's your job. Knowing how serious Bret is about almost everything makes me feel a little bit sorry for him in a way. He clearly has trouble knowing how to separate work from his everyday life. He has a lot to be proud of, but he carries a lot of anger and frustration as well. It's interesting to see that on the eve of the big fight, Bret had his entire family with him. There are numerous scenes of Bret's wife saying goodbye to various WWF employees backstage. Bret's kids are probably a bit too young to understand the situation in its entirety, and are seen playing with several of the wrestlers. Bret's wife points out that the kids have grown up with all these people. Bret's youngest son Blade says that practically everyone there knows him, and that it's kind of like losing friends. He's also asked if he understands why his dad is leaving, and he shakes his head and says no. I think moments like this with Bret's kids are genuinely much sadder than any of Bret's moody monologues we've had throughout the film so far. Just before the fight, Bret and Vince have a meeting in Vince's office, which is also hilariously labelled as the women's dressing room. Bret wears a wire in this interview, and both parties say that they both feel betrayed in this situation. Vince states that it's only Ted Turner standing between them, and Bret says that the way this whole situation has played out has been really tough. Vince sounds quite sincere here. He says that he's open to anything in regards to how this match is going to finish. Bret says he doesn't have to necessarily beat Shawn. They could brawl outside and finish it in a disqualification, and he can make a farewell speech to the fans. Vince says he'd be okay with a disqualification via interference from a run-in. In any case, it all sounds as if it's going to be alright on the night. The big fight starts, and if you've ever seen this match, you'll know that it's not particularly long. Neither is it a 5-star classic. It's not bad, but it obviously just ends quite abruptly. This film was probably the first source of the match's actual planned finish. Well, Bret's plan for the finish, that is. The plan was for guys from D-Generation X and the Hart Foundation to run in when Shawn tries to put Bret in his own finisher, the sharpshooter. The resulting chaos was going to cause the match to be called off, with Bret being disqualified. Bret could leave without losing and go out on sort of a high. Well, of course, none of that happens, does it? This film provides great little snippets of footage that, in hindsight, act like evidence in piecing together a crime. Soon after the bell rings, you can see Triple H almost sprinting down to the ring, where he quickly ushers Shawn away. By this stage, the referee Earl Hebner had absolutely bailed out of there, and a mix of WWF employees, security, and police escort Michaels and Triple H to the backstage area. It may come as a shock to casual and non-wrestling fans who think it's all fake, but wrestling crowds can and have rioted in the past. This was very much the fear of WWF and venue staff at this point in time. Probably the best bit of fly-on-the-wall footage that this documentary provides, though, is what happens backstage after the show ends. A livid Bret says, "That piece of shit's locked himself in his office." In the locker room, Shawn Michaels swears that his hands are clean of this one. He swears to God and leaves as quick as he can. We cut to the hallway and see Bret's wife berating a bunch of WWF wrestlers and employees lined up against the wall like a bunch of naughty school kids. The culprits include Triple H and the Legion of Doom's Animal. Triple H says he had nothing to do with it, but Bret's wife will have none of it and tells him that what goes around comes around. I don't know, Triple H is still doing pretty well these days if you ask me. The next time we see Bret is back in the locker room. He looks a lot calmer as he proclaims he found Vince and knocked him right out with a punch to the face. This appears to be true, as the next shot we see is of a groggy-looking Vince walking very gingerly down the hallway. The film crew's timing and placement couldn't have been more perfect here. Bret claims that there was no other choice but to get up and punch Vince at the time. He describes his actions as a Stu Hart judgment call. So it all ends with Bret out of the WWF and he's headed to the WCW. Bret's final interview in the film reveals that maybe Vince treated him this way because Vince has a history of treating wrestlers like dirt, and Bret was becoming too noisy and demanded safeguards in his contract. Vince had to make an example of him. It's a valid opinion, I suppose. Bret's not the only person to say such things about Vince in the WWF. Even now, 20 years later, professional wrestlers complain of lack of job security, lack of health insurance, bullying, and no union representation. But in the end, was it all really as bad as Bret made it out to be in this film? Sure, Bret had a right to be angry at how the WWF treated him after 15 years of service, but it wasn't as if he was going to be made redundant. Bret was perhaps one of the WWF's highest paid wrestlers when he left. He got to leave kind of on his own free will, and immediately went to work for WCW on a lighter workload and for a huge sum of money. So while it sucks that WWF were quite disrespectful to him in the end, it's not necessarily a bad ending for Bret at all. Well, unless you consider how Bret's wrestling career ended while he was in WCW, but that's another story. Overall, I think this film is pretty good. I have a soft spot for it because I saw it when it came out as part of a film festival when I was a student. I had been a fan as a kid, and when I saw this documentary about Bret Hart advertised for the festival, I jumped at the chance to see it. It's definitely a must-see for any professional wrestling fan. Would it appeal to non-wrestling fans? That's not for me to say, but it gets an 8.2 out of 10 on IMDb at least. I think the tone is probably a bit too over the top sometimes, but where it shines is in its backstage footage of various facets of the wrestling business. One of the best things about this movie is that it's free to watch in certain territories on the National Film Board of Canada's website. You can also download it there for a very low price. Thanks, Canada! What do you think of Wrestling with Shadows? Was the Montreal Screw Job real, or was it just the mother of all carefully scripted plots to hike the WWF's ratings? Leave a comment and let us know.